Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to wish anyone observing Ramadan Kareem. My name is Basima Sisemore. I'm a researcher with the Othering and Belonging Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all and to have Dr. Maha Hilal and Dipa Fernandez with us here today to discuss Dr. Hilal's new book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. This here is the book, whoops, that we'll be discussing. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to self-describe myself for those joining who might be visually impaired. I am a light-skinned brown woman with shoulder-length, dark brown, very curly hair. I'm wearing gold hoop earrings as well as brown rimmed glasses, and I have a brown and cream knitted sweater on. And in my background, there's a white curtain and a Moroccan painted table or dresser with a plant on it and 2 photos above. I also need to acknowledge that the Othering and Belonging Institute is located at the University of California, Berkeley, which is on unceded land of the Ohlone people. And I personally am joining from the land of the Northern Pomo people, which is located in the central and coastal regions of Northern California. If you'd like to name the place you're joining from, please feel free to drop the name in the chat. And also, if you're learning the name of the land that you're on, we are going to drop a link where you can locate that, and you can share that as well if you'd like. So again, welcome. To give you an overview of our time together for the next hour and a half, I'm going to now introduce our speakers, and then Dr. Hilal will lead us through a presentation on her book, followed by a discussion with our discussant, Dipa Fernandez. And then I'll follow up with a couple questions, and then we'll open up Q&A to the questions that come in the chat from the audience. So on that note, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be collecting those, and we'll bring those up in the Q&A session. So first of all, I'd like to now introduce Dr. Maha Hilal, who is a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia and author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, and Common Dreams, among other outlets. She is the founding executive director of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, an organizer with Witness Against Torture, and a council member of the School of the Americas Watch. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law and Society at American University in Washington, D.C., and she received her master's degree in counseling and her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Dr. Hilal, and I'd like to invite you to share where you're joining us from, as well as to self-describe yourself, and please feel free to share anything else that you'd like to share with the audience in your introduction.
Well, thank you so much, Basima, for organizing and hosting this event. And thank you to the Othering and Belonging Institute and Deepa Fernandez for joining us here today. I am a Muslim woman. I wear hijab. Right now I have a blue hijab on. I have yellow glasses, and I'm wearing a black jacket. And on top of the hijab, I'm wearing black headphones.
Thank you so much, Maha. And now I'd like to introduce Dipa Fernandez, a journalist who covers immigration and immigrant communities for the San Francisco Chronicle. She comes to the Chronicle from an award-winning career in broadcast journalism, reporting from around the world for NPR, the BBC, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Fernandes was named Radio Reporter of the Year for 2017, 2018, and 2019 by the LA Press Club. And among the many awards she has won is an LA Area Emmy while reporting with KCEP in Los Angeles. She has a master's in journalism from Columbia University. Welcome, Deepa. I want to invite you to do the same, to come on screen and share where you're joining us from, as well as to self-describe yourself and anything else you'd like to share with the audience.
Thank you, Basima, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to describe myself. I am a South Asian woman. I am sitting in my dining room this morning, and behind me are a couple of pot plants and a speaker and a photo that my husband took when we were at the Taj Mahal. And I have gray hair, which is pulled back. I'm wearing earrings, red hoop earrings, and a favorite necklace of a friend who had passed away in the last few years, and she passed it on to me, and it's beads of red and orange and gray, and I am wearing a red shirt, and I'm very honored to be here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Hilal's talk today.
Thank you so much, Deepa. So first off, Dr. Hilal, congratulations on publishing your first book. We're going to be dropping the link in the chat for people to check it out and purchase. And I hope this is the first book of many to come in which you'll impart your brilliance on us and we can engage in your work. Your book is such an important and accessible piece of work that helps us to understand the impact of state violence on Muslims as manifested and enforced through the war on terror narrative and its sprawling infrastructure. You also touch upon in your book Institutionalized Islamophobia, and that as well, the sprawling infrastructure that is connected to that across US law, policy, militarism, as well as the harms of internalized Islamophobia and how the impacts of internalized Islamophobia not only impact Muslim individuals and the Muslim community, but that it actually also helps to further promote and perpetuate institutionalized Islamophobia. So I know you'll be discussing more of this in greater detail in your presentation. And so with that, I would like to open the floor to you to walk us through your book.
Well, thank you very much, Basima, again, for hosting this event. I am going to attempt to share my screen. Can you guys all see the screen, actually? The presentation? Okay, cool. So I'm really excited to be here. It's an honor to speak about my book with all of you and to really have a discussion about what is institutionalized Islamophobia and what has the war on terror meant for the last 2 decades since it was conceived of, and where do we go from here? So usually when I start my presentations about this book, and in fact, this poem is also in my book. This is a poem, an excerpt from a poem called Waiting for the Barbarians. And I'm not going to read it verbatim, but the point of this poem is that in this context, the United States has always defined itself in terms of who other people are. So we are always whatever they're not, or whatever they are. And in this particular context of the war on terror, we define ourselves in morally superior ways because we always have to be opposite and we're different than those barbarians, those evil people, right? In this case, Muslims. And this is kind of the framework through which the war on terror has been fought. That we have to fight this thing, right? Because we are so fundamentally different, that we are so fundamentally moral and pure. And the people who did this to us are of sort of a different species. And how do we understand that? And the war on terror has fundamentally been about empire, right? And every empire needs enemies to justify its existence, right? And that's one of the reasons why, when we talk about the war on terror, not only has it not ended, but it builds off of all previous wars that the United States has engaged in, which also haven't ended. Because in this country, wars don't end. They simply morph into new wars that preserve the brutality of wars past. And this is important because at this point, this country is a very efficient and effective war machine. 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, Bush gave a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he said the term war on terror for the very first time. Now, the reason I always start my presentations with this quote is precisely one for that reason, because it's the first use of this phrase that we are now talking about, right, 20 years later. Second, because in retrospect, when we think about how unending and nebulous this war has become, this speech, in fact, turned out to be very instructive, because what he was doing was essentially telling us that there would be no limits in terms of time, there would be no barriers in terms of the tactics that we could use, and that there would be a buildup of such a massive infrastructure that when we look back years later, dismantling it and scaling it back seems almost impossible. And when we ask questions, as we did around the 9/11 anniversary last year, which marked 20 years, in terms of how did we get to where we are? To me, this quote answers much of that question. In this same speech, Bush said later on, whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done. And that's also very instructive. Because what he is saying is, we're not going to tell you yet what this will look like. What does counterterrorism mean? But just know that whatever it is that we do, and now we have 20 years of examples, you should consider that justice. And if you consider that justice, then there should be no follow-up questions. So who's to blame, right? In this country, we often see political context in a vacuum. So when the 9/11 attacks happened, the narrative was around largely how inconceivable this was. Because if we only look at the history at that particular point in time, then it makes no sense. How could a group of people, as Bush asked in his speech, that same speech, hate us this much? What else does that do? There's a particular reason why these narratives are used in the ways that they were and the ways that they continue to be used. So in this quote from Rumsfeld, he's basically laying the blame on everything that happens in the course of the war on terror on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It doesn't matter what the United States does, because you should know that it always comes back to who's responsible for this conflict in the first place. And this is important because we know in the last 20 years, the amount of abuse targeting war crimes that have happened under the guise of the war on terror that simply cannot be excused, no matter who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And this continues to be a narrative thread throughout the war on terror, right? That even when the United States is engaged in such conduct, that we are still not to blame. You might remember last summer when Ilhan Omar made a comment about the United States, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban being held accountable for victimizing individuals and communities, right? And in response, she received a lot of backlash. And the common refrain to all the backlash was, how dare you compare the United States and Israel to Afghanistan and the Taliban? And what is the operating premise there? The operating premise is that there is something morally superior between state violence and non-state actor violence. Of course, Afghanistan tends to fall into a separate category, which is a failed state, but nevertheless, the idea is that these two forms of violence are incomparable because of simply who the actor is. When you look at these sorts of narratives, one of the important parts about it is that it is often the case that if you switch merely who the subject is, what is being described often applies, in fact, to the United States' own violence. In this quote that you see on the screen, President Bush is talking about how immoral it is, right, to kill women and children, as if the United States has not killed women and children. And underlying a lot of these narratives is not just a question of state violence versus non-state actor violence, but also that, again, there is something fundamentally different in this case about Muslims. There are these others whose behavior we simply cannot understand. And if we can't understand it, then the only solution is to use brute force to intervene in it. In my book, I talk a lot about narratives. And the reason I spend so much time talking about narratives is because of the fact that narratives happen to legitimize and justify laws and policies that target individuals, communities, and societies. It's no accident that when you use dehumanizing language of groups of people, that when others see them on TV being tortured, that they hardly blink an eye, because people have been primed to accept those individuals as less than human. Some of the narratives that I talk about specifically in my book include the idea that everything changed post 9/11, right? The whole world entered into this new era of time. And of course, there are few other countries that would have the audacity to say that, even if something similar happened to it. And we know that there are many countries, of course, that experience mass atrocities all the time, including at the hands of the United States government. This idea of civilization and freedom, that the United States is the epitome of civilization and freedom. And it's this very fact that led to why the United States was targeted in the first place, because those people were jealous of our freedom, so jealous that they decided that the only way to address their jealousy was to wage an attack on the United States. Then American exceptionalism. This is repeatedly reinforced, right? Especially through the idea that no matter what the United States does, it still retains its moral superiority. Then there's the idea of Muslim humanity and rage. Now, not only does the dehumanization of Muslims make abuse, torture, detention, murder possible, it also allows people to think it's acceptable, because we're pushing these people out of this idea of who are part of our community. I don't have time to talk about this in this particular presentation, but there's a theory of moral exclusion, which talks about essentially the consequences of seeing people outside of your moral community, which is that these same rules of fairness and justice that you apply to members of your own community are different to those you see outside of their community. And if you're interested in that theory, I would suggest reading Susan Apatow, and we can perhaps drop it in the link later. But the point is that dehumanization serves a very particular role. And therefore, people that want to legitimize and justify certain policies are very intentional about dehumanizing those who the policies are directed at. And terrorism and moral equivalencies. I just gave an example of moral equivalencies. But with terrorism, the recurring idea is that Muslims are uniquely prone to acts of terrorism, that an act of violence only counts as terrorism when it's perpetrated by a Muslim. And we hear now these discussions about domestic terrorism, right? And when we think about the landscape of who it will be applied to, even when it's applied to white perpetrators of violence, it never really sticks because there has already been a well-established construction of who it is that this designation applies to. This is along similar lines of what I just talked about, dehumanization, right? When you begin to talk about people as though they're not human, when you see pictures such as those that came out of Abu Ghraib, in which some of the most egregious torture was committed against Iraqis, when you see what happens and has happened at Guantanamo Bay, what do you deduce other than that these people are less than human? And if they're less than human, then this abuse, torture, detention is sanctioned. We don't have to treat them the way we treat others in our community. And there is a constant demonization of Muslims, not just in the United States, but indeed across the globe. Whether it's the Philippines, whether it's India, right? Whether it's Burma. There is this constant narrative of Muslims being the threat, Muslims somehow wanting the destruction of societies in which they belong and are part of. And when we use that rhetoric, right, it becomes again easier to target them. And one of the ways this manifests itself specifically, right, is the United States can just say, oh, that drone strike we just launched was, we just killed a couple members of Al-Qaeda. Who knows if they're really Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, separately, we know that the United States seriously undercounts civilian deaths, civilian murders, I should say. But it's just this idea that whoever we killed, it doesn't really matter, right? Just think of them as Al-Qaeda and rest assured that even so, if we go back to Bush's original quote about justice, that constitutes justice. Many of you have probably heard this, idea that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Now, this is a way of understanding political conflict and the weaponization of the use of terrorism, particularly against non-state actors. And while it is powerful in helping us think through how do we understand, again, political violence, it also assumes that there's no criteria through which we can actually measure each form of violence and how they compare. And why is that important? It's important because, again, when we're talking about the state and the violence it inflicts as somehow morally superior and different from non-state actor violence, then that is to say, and that is to allow the state to get away with much more brutality and much more violence. Last summer, again, when Ilhan Omar was receiving a lot of backlash, I wrote an op-ed in Al Jazeera on this question of moral equivalence. And the idea behind it is that, besides making the assertion that state violence is inherently more moral, there are actually ways we can measure, right? Is state violence inherently more moral if it kills 3 times as many civilians? What about that makes state violence more moral? And so what is the criteria we're using to judge which form of violence is more legitimate than the other? And this is not to say or to sanction either form of violence, but it is, however, to intervene in the state's ability to use this explanation to wage unfettered violence, in this case, the United States, domestically and across the globe. So on the narrative theme, still, one of the sections I address is what happened at Abu Ghraib prison in 2004. For some of you in the audience, perhaps this is a distant memory, if you know about it at all at this point. And this section, this particular atrocity, is addressed in a section of the book called Not a Dent in the Narrative. And what this section is particularly about is the idea that no matter what happens, no matter what the United States does, the narrative remains consistent in terms of descriptions of what this country is about, who this country is, and the values it supposedly adheres to and espouses. In other words, it has no impact. So you can see on the right-hand side 3 different quotes. And the focus here in all 3 of the quotes is about the kind of country the United States is. It's not about who was harmed. It's not about who was tortured. It's about preserving a particular image of the United States. And it's about convincing, in fact, as you can see in Bush's quote, the very people who are the targets of the violence, that this is not who the United States is. And why does the United States have to do this? Because for one, it has to maintain the narrative of American exceptionalism. And for two, the idea is to present these instances, atrocities, as anomalies in the greater scheme of the war on terror. And when we present them as such, then the state still resumes its place as moral, as a moral actor. So in 2012, 16 villagers were massacred in Kandahar, Afghanistan by a US soldier. And in response, President Obama said, "It appeared you had a lone gunman on his own. In no way is this representative of the enormous sacrifices that our men and women have made in Afghanistan." But sacrifices for whom? The Afghans who were killed, or the ones who watched or who survived to watch the United States destroy their country? And of course, this narrative obscures the idea of why the United States was in Afghanistan in the first place. And also, similar to what happened with Abu Ghraib and many other examples, there is no reflection on the victims of this atrocity, because it always comes back to the United States preserving its image, again, no matter what happens, to challenge that image. On June 10th of 2006, 3 prisoners at Guantanamo died by suicide, allegedly. In response to the suicides, an individual named Rear Admiral Harry B. Harris said, quote, "They are smart, they are creative, they are committed. They have no regard for life, either ours or their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us." This is particularly violent because for 3 individuals to die by suicide in a prison context would, for most people, be understood as an act of desperation. But because of the ways that Muslims have been so maligned and demonized, it is deemed appropriate to describe the victims of U.S. state violence as perpetrators even post-mortem. And it really behooves us to think about the level of dehumanization that would allow for this sort of response when 3 people who were detained at a notorious prison could be treated and spoken about in this way after they have died. Needless to say, the war on terror has always been rooted in and entrenched with Islamophobia. Sometimes it is tempting to simply speak about interpersonal Islamophobia because that might seem easier to challenge, to disrupt. You're dealing with members of your own community of society with whom you can implement interventions, right, that rely on goodwill, getting to know each other, etc. But the war on terror is much more than that. The war on terror is about Islamophobia embedded into the structures of the state. It's about a system, an entire war that was devised on the basis of the criminalization of Muslims. And when we're describing this phenomenon of Islamophobia, I recognize that not everyone uses that term. I use the term Islamophobia because I think it's important to emphasize the religious element, which is to say that there are very particular problematic and negative constructions of Islam itself as a religion. That doesn't minimize the fact that Muslim communities are extremely diverse, and so the ways that different Muslims experience Islamophobia are different. But there is a very deeply embedded anti-religious animus in the ways that Muslims are treated. I use the term and the idea of phobia, not because it's irrational fear, as other definitions imply and suggest, but because I believe it's contrived fear. If you look at the images, for example, that have been released of the men in Guantanamo, they look disheveled, they look like monsters. I mean, there's a very intentional depiction of these men as people that are scary. And when you present them in such a way, right, you're creating this collective narrative about these monsters, again, with whom we must use certain tactics and pretty much brute force because there's no other way to deal with them. And Islam is seen as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, opposed to normative democratic values, right? It's constructed that way. And this, of course, comes back to and serves the state's purpose of saying that not only is this the reason why they attacked us, these Muslims, but also, for example, why in Iraq, in Afghanistan, we have to go back and bring democracy to the people, right? Because these people don't know what it is. And then finally, Islamophobia is about pushing people, pushing Muslims outside of, again, these moral boundaries that are extended to other communities. And of course, this results in dire consequences, not just in terms of prejudice and discrimination, but also in terms of detention, right? In terms of torture, in terms of murder. This might seem like an obvious question at this point in terms of what is the war on terror. But it's important to come back to this question time and time again. When I thought about answering this question, I wasn't entirely sure what exactly I would say to describe it. The further I got into the research, the more I understood, of course, that far from the way that the war on terror has often been narrowly conceived of as a military campaign abroad, the war on terror has been much more than that. It is a multi-dimensional campaign that has not only been waged abroad, but has been waged domestically as well. And this is extremely important because it is in the government's interest to allow us to believe that there is no connection between what is happening at home and what is happening abroad. And not just in terms of how we fight and challenge these policies, but also in terms of who we forge solidarity with. So I talk about this taxonomy of the war on terror in my book, of which there are 5 dimensions: militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And again, this is my attempt to understand the totality of the war on terror. Because we talk about, at least in social justice spaces, what does it mean to dismantle and abolish the war on terror? But until we know exactly what the war on terror is, that goal is quite nebulous. So putting some boundaries and sort of like articulating this framework for what it is, what is the war on terror, at least for me, made it easier to think about, again, not just the purview of the war, but also how all of these things are connected. As with other communities experiencing violence, Muslims have internalized oppression, and in particular, of course, internalized Islamophobia. Sometimes there is the perception that internalized oppression is sort of applied erroneously when it comes to survival mechanisms, such as if a Muslim woman stops wearing hijab because she feels that her safety is at risk. That's not internalized Islamophobia. Internalized Islamophobia is the idea that Muslims themselves absorb these problematic narratives about Islam and Muslims that the state primes us to think about. That Islam and Muslims are particularly violent, terroristic, backwards, repressive, uniquely patriarchal, and the list goes on, without evidence to suggest that is disproportionately present in Muslim communities. And it's this uncritical acceptance of these very ideas. And what are some of the consequences? One very noticeable one, and perhaps one that many of you may have observed, is this idea that we must condemn acts of violence and what are constructed as acts of terrorism that are perpetrated by Muslims. Because that is what happens when the government and when society at large makes Muslims believe that they are disproportionately responsible for the acts of violence constructed as terrorism, whether domestically or abroad. And what also happens under the guise, and sort of not under the guise, but when internalized Islamophobia is manifested, at least in my observation and analysis, is that in some cases, Muslim victimhood itself is denied and minimized by other Muslims. And if that becomes the case, and if that is the case, and that reality exists simultaneously to the reality that the state also doesn't care, and in fact, it's not just about apathy, right? It's about active harm, then that leaves Muslims in an ever more precarious state. There's a video of a BuzzFeed video that was published, I believe, in 2015. When I looked at it for the book, it had over 3 million views. And the pretext of the video was this idea that I'm Muslim, but I'm not angry. It's like, I'm Muslim and I like Thanksgiving, things along those lines. And now what was very problematic about this is that they were seemingly trying to dispel these problematic stereotypes of Muslims. But the problem is that when you do it in this way, you're reiterating necessarily the dominant ideas that exist in the first place. You're legitimizing them, in fact, by contradicting them and opposing them. So when you say, I'm Muslim, but I'm not a terrorist, you're giving that particular narrative that Muslims are terrorists, you're giving it air, and you're legitimizing it by responding to it. And it's a very interesting video because it was widely celebrated amongst Muslims as well. And when you look at the ways in which internalized oppression and internalized Islamophobia are manifested in different contexts, this seems to be, although perceived as a more effective strategy, is in fact in the long term preserving the very same ideas that this idea of a counter narrative are meant to challenge. This is a more theoretical approach to internalized oppression from a scholar named Albert Memmi. And it's this idea that we want to be like these oppressors, right? People that are in these marginalized communities. They start to believe what the oppressor tells them about themselves. And you can imagine that when you're in a context, generally speaking, in the United States, which is what we're talking about and what the country that we're addressing today, in which many groups are already otherized, it serves the state if not only can they otherize communities, but then that community takes it upon themselves to further otherize themselves by virtue of accepting these problematic narratives and ideas that they have been taught to believe about themselves. And I recognize I am running up against the clock, so I'm going to try to go quickly just to finish this so we can have a robust discussion. But these are just a couple other examples from a masjid in DC that received money from the DHS to do countering violent extremism work. In the left-hand corner, you can see that there are two Muslims, one holding a sign that says terrorism has no religion, and the other is I am Muslim. And then it says, I oppose terrorism. Muslims are an integral part of the American fabric, and we oppose extremism in any form. Now, the question is, if terrorism has no religion, why are the only two people in this picture Muslim? Second, with the picture on the right-hand side, where the young girl is holding a Quran, and it says, Dear God, tell them I'm not a terrorist. Well, if they didn't already think she was a terrorist, now you've primed people to make them see her as a terrorist, because you're instilling that idea in their minds by virtue of this messaging. So needless to say, the impacts on Muslims have been vast, not just in terms of what the state inflicts directly, but in terms of the overarching socio-political context, which impacts the community psychologically, and in terms of how we see ourselves. Finally, these are just some of the quotes that I pulled out from interviews that I conducted with Muslim Americans. And they spoke to a lot of the struggles that Muslims are facing, right? In this particular case, Bijan speaks to the idea that the community became even more divided because of the tactics of the state, in particular the FBI. Rosita is speaking about what does it mean to intentionally otherize Muslims, right? Is the war on terror over? No, it's not, as Rosita articulates. What would it actually mean? And then finally, Buthaina speaks about what would collective liberation mean? What does it mean? And this is one of the questions I asked every single participant. Finally, I want to end with this picture, which, as you can see, has a quote on the top that says, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature," which was from President Bush on 9/11, 2001. And then a quote on the bottom that says, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge." The picture in the middle is of graffiti in Yemen with a US drone that says, "Why did you kill my family?" And the reason I wanted to end with this is that the war on terror has always been about social constructions and who has the power to define the terms on which the war has been fought. The word evil is used very intentionally to describe inherent characteristics. And when you have inherent characteristics, such as being evil, the only solution, again, is to use brute force. You cannot rehabilitate someone out of being evil. We often talk about the endless war on terror. And while it was designed to be nebulous and, in fact, never ending, that does not mean there are not ways to curb, dismantle, and abolish it. It does mean that it takes creativity, right? And it does mean that in order for us to actually dismantle and abolish the war on terror, that we have to understand where it started and how we got to where we are today. So 20 years later, it's important for us to develop and continue discussing and think about the implications of the war on terror, not just on the Muslim community, but on all communities, including BIPOC communities, the United States itself, and the global community, if we're going to disrupt, at least, and at best, abolish the war on terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maha, for that really concise overview. And I really appreciate your framing and analysis around the war on terror narrative and just how critical, even understanding the multiple facets of the narrative and how that plays out to reinforce American exceptionalism, and how challenging that narrative even reflects as if you're challenging American values, democracy, freedom. So I really appreciate this overview that you've provided, and also touching on how Islamophobia is internalized by Muslims and what that actually means. And again, how that feeds into the institutionalized Islamophobia. And one statistic that you share in your book that I found really shocking, at least because it helped me to kind of visualize what we're talking about when we talk about the breadth and scope of the war on terror, which, as you described, is this nebulous war that has no boundaries and no end. And you state that 39% of countries have been involved in the U.S. counterterrorism war. That's around 80 countries. And so that's a really strong visual for me to think about. And I do want to ask, does that include U.S. allies, or what does that mean when you say that this percentage of countries have been involved in U.S. counterterrorism?
Yeah, so it does include U.S. allies, and then I think there's obviously varying degrees of involvement with U.S. allies, and how active the different countries are in the war on terror, but the idea is just that they have participated in some capacity in the U.S.'s war on terror.
Yeah, it was really taken aback to read that. Right. And so I have some questions that I want to follow up with you on, and I know Deepa also has some questions for you as well. And I just want to open up the discussion and bring Deepa into the conversation to share some reflections and to engage with you. And also, again, for the audience, please keep writing and thinking and gathering your questions and dropping them in the chat. We'll be getting to them shortly in our Q&A session. So Deepa, I open it to you.
Thank you, Basima. And thank you, Maha, Dr. Hilal. That was so comprehensive. And I think the thing that I got from reading your book, and, I think 20 years later, it's almost an obligation for all of us to read it, because I think you have cataloged many of the things that happened and were reported at the time in the press, and then we moved on. The country moved on, and I think the thing that, I was a young reporter. I just started reporting soon after 9/11, and what I ended up covering in the days and weeks and months after the 9/11 attacks in New York City, where I lived, I was dispatched out because we kept getting calls saying they came and took our men. They came and took my husband. They came and took my brother. And the they was kind of nebulous. It wasn't exactly clear who the they was. But I remember spending hours, days with Muslim women in the far reaches of Brooklyn and Queens, where they were weeping, they were stunned, they were in shock, they were unable to understand or fathom why suddenly their husband or son or brother was taken. And as a reporter, my job is to confirm a story. And one of the first things I did after having these intense stories just pour into my microphone and just listen and get all the details I could, and they were very detailed stories, I would go back, and at my desk, I would start by calling the NYPD. And nope, we didn't make any arrests today. Call the INS, then the Immigration and Naturalization Services. Nope, we didn't make any arrests today. Then called the FBI. And it wasn't until a couple years later, and I think it was the ACLU that sued and found out that actually all those agencies were involved, and that there were sweeps in the days, weeks, months after 9/11, even years after. There was a registration program for Muslim men. And I not only saw it up close, I was part of that machine that was reporting it so that people would know what was going on. And that machine being the press in general. And I guess what I want to ask you, Dr. Hilal, is, I came away from reading your book, which is really such an indictment when taken as a whole of all these US actions, from what happened in Abu Ghraib, which, I had a moment of like, oh, right, this was horrible. Like, how did I stop thinking about this? And to read the detail that you put in there just about what actually happened there. We saw that in photos at the time, and there was some collective outrage, and then we moved on. Guantanamo, and the fact that that people have been there, men have been there, boys, juveniles have been there for decade plus, without trials, without, in some cases, access to attorneys. And I guess I'm wondering, what role do you think that we journalists, that the media played in creating this? And I want to say that I myself, in that immediate period afterwards, it was very hard as a journalist to push back on government rhetoric that was coming out. Editors not so into that. And I was a young reporter, but still, some of us tried. But it was all over. Every government official said it, was saying versions of the same thing. And, in retrospect, it seemed like the press just reported it uncritically. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the role of the media as one of the actors in this war on terror, which honestly, I have to say, after reading your book, I came away and felt more like it's a war on Muslims.
Well, thank you so much, Deepa, for your time and your amazing, incredible reporting, and for being such an outstanding journalist. I mean, that's what we need in this field. And we know that, narratives of the government don't thrive without the media. The media are one of the vehicles through which they are given air. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways that the media obviously has very much colluded with the state. That happened a lot, for example, around the Iraq War. We can see that now 20 years later at this point, 19, I guess, from the Iraq War, where we see how the coverage of Ukraine, right, Russia's war against Ukraine, and there have been so many people, right, talking about how differently these wars are covered, whether we're talking about foreign fighters, for example, right, coming to the aid of Ukrainians, and how that would have been covered in other contexts had it been, for example, in Yemen or Palestine or whichever country. And so I think the ways that they're differentially reported on, and the idea, and this is something I experienced in academia as well, is the idea of objectivity. There's no such thing as objectivity. And, in my experience, objectivity is usually assigned to white people with the perception and the idea that they are the only ones who have an objective opinion, and everyone else has by default a bias. And I think that that's a huge problem, because we know that the media is not objective. I mean, there are ways you can seek to be, right, a little bit more objective, whatever that really means. But I think it goes without saying, right, that everyone has a perspective, and it is oftentimes injected into the writings, right, the ways that journalists talk about issues, the headlines themselves, right, that are given to articles. For example, when I was doing research for my dissertation many, many years ago, there was a book whose title I don't remember offhand, but they cataloged a lot of the different titles that were given, and some were like Rats in a Trap, referring to Al-Qaeda and Taliban, or titles like something about hunting this terrorist out of a hole. So there's also this dehumanizing language. So there's a lot of ways that the power of language and narrative, right, is very much a part of how journalism and the media either contribute to the dehumanization of Muslims or can actually seek to disrupt that. And unfortunately, I mean, when you see journalism and particularly reporting as simply just about telling the story and the facts, I think a lot of times you lose sight of that, because it is more than that. I mean, if you have 10 different reporters covering one story, most likely, right, you're not going to get the exact same story. And they might similarly convey all the facts and details of what happened. But that's not to say that there are no differences in how it's actually conveyed, how it's written, what is the language that's used. Like sometimes every word literally matters, right? In terms of whether or not you see communities and groups as criminals or whether you see them as innocent. And we know that because there has been a very intentional effort from the government to demonize Muslims in this case. And again, it's often the media and reporters who have reified that and reiterated the very same claims and narrative of the government.
So, I'd love to know, and I think this goes to your to what you call internalized Islamophobia, because obviously, if you're seeing it in the media all around you, if you're hearing those messages, it's hard not to internalize. And it was very interesting in your talk, the BuzzFeed video that you showed, and the kind of propaganda from the mosques funded by the government. I wonder how you think we could do better in the media, like how, because I think what you've shown us is that there's a direct cost or a toll because of this. Which when I think about my journalism, my theory is first do no harm. And so if we want to do better, how do you suggest? Do you have any advice for us? And I think because that's where people are forming their ideas from. It's from watching and listening and reading to the coverage that we do.
Right. So whenever there's an act of violence, right, constructed as terrorism that's perpetrated by Muslims, there's always this inevitable question of, why aren't Muslims condemning this act of terrorism? And I think, there are many different individuals that are responsible for the constant insertion of that question, but I think it's about reshaping the story, right? Why are we asking this question? Why do we keep, and not only why are we asking it, but why are we asking it in a rhetorical way? Which is to say that even when you ask it and even when it's answered, it doesn't satisfy the questioner anyway. So why do we keep asking it? And what burden are we putting on the people who are being asked the same question repeatedly? So I think that's one part. And then also, these discussions happen, I think, a lot more and with a lot more depth in the migration and immigration spaces, but the idea of forced migration, right? That we can't understand the United States' immigration policies and the responsibility it bears for the amount of immigrants and the countries from which immigrants are coming without understanding the forced causes of migration. So I think that those are both, really important parts of the story. Why are we not telling the story in its totality? Why are the stories being told in a vacuum? And so I think that that's another way you can get at a bigger and broader picture of the story. And in doing so, right, it's not about, injecting necessarily bias, but there is this larger picture and this larger context through which we have to understand these issues that are often very narrowly conceived and in a vacuum, because that is in the interest of the state. When these stories are sort of meant to be, bite-sized, and you can understand it by knowing 2 minutes about, the United States is so generous in the context of immigrants and migrants, for example. So I think that there are just, there's a lot of things that could be done, but, I think those are some of the ways. And I think the last thing I'd say is, where is attention directed? And I know that this is probably driven by, what audiences are interested in and what there's funding for. But, why do we spend more time on a conflict with, where there are white victims versus a conflict where there are brown and black victims? Like, why is that? And really recognizing that there are actual consequences to that. It's not just an observation and something that doesn't go anywhere. It's an observation, and it is something that turns into material consequences for the people who are the targets of the harm.
Yeah. I feel like, in a way, two things that your book really made me realize. One was that the sum of all the little, or not little, but the individual actions that happened was this. It served to make regular Muslim life suspect. In a way of, mosques became this place where there must be terrorists hiding, or at least one person going in there has nefarious goals and is trying to do something. And the little ways in which that happened was the various ways in which the FBI surveillance of mosques and I myself, in researching for some coverage that we at the Chronicle did for the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I did a lot of reading of articles that went back. And, when you do that in retrospect, it's kind of shocking, because you're seeing just article after article after article that fits the exact narrative that you're talking to us about, yet they were coming out at the times. So just regular religious life became suspect for Muslims. Right. Schools became suspect. If you went to a religious school as a Muslim, that must be for nefarious. That must be a terrorist training camp. And so I wonder, in a way, it has been internalized. How do we undo that? How do we start to, and your examples that you showed us obviously are not the way to do it. How do we do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think, there's a lot to be said about how we unlearn internalized oppression. And, obviously there are many groups, many communities that are dealing with this because of the constant bombardment of all these problematic ideas. And so, I think getting a grasp on what's actually being said and how it's impacting the community. So when Muslims, for example, are consistently subjected to responding to acts of violence that are perpetrated by other Muslims, what does that instill within them? What is the message that they are being sent, right? And it's often, felt by Muslims, well, if I don't respond to this, if I don't reject this act of violence, then, I'm going to be seen as a terrorist. And, maybe more of us have to start rejecting that and not responding to it in order for this, pretty horrible idea to, continue to persist. Because why is it that we're responding to this? And, I think people sometimes think about the short-term gains versus the long-term gains in narratives. And to me, that might be a short-term gain and a short-term strategy in terms of, rejecting an act of violence perpetrated by a Muslim. But to me, it's not a long-term strategy, unless your long-term strategy is continuing to perpetuate the idea of collective responsibility. So I think there's a lot of deep work that has to be done in marginalized communities and, Muslim communities in particular, because of, this consistent bombardment of ideas. But I think what's important also to impart here is that, the buck doesn't just stop at like, we have to condemn an act of terrorism, right? In many cases, it goes much further, which is that Muslims themselves and other oppressed communities become active agents of the state that are participants in harming the communities from which they belong. And that's when internalized Islamophobia and internalized oppression become doubly problematic. And when you're not challenging that, when you're not naming it, when you're not deconstructing it, then you're basically leading to your community being harmed over and over and over again. And by forces that, uniquely pose a challenge because it's within your community and without your community that are, inflicting this oppression on, a target.
I don't know if I have any time left to ask one more question, Basima, or if we want to go to the questions from the audience.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. So I think, as I wonder if in like that, this is a very US and local sense almost that I've been talking with you about. But if we pull back globally, which your book is also really about, it feels like this war on Muslims is not just a US thing. It's happening in India. It's happening in China. It's happening. There's many places in the world, the Middle East, where Muslims are targeted purely because they're Muslims. And I wonder if, sometimes these things seem really huge to take on. I mean, you did it in the book. So I'm just wondering, in a going forward, 20 years after 9/11, in a global sense, I mean, it leaves one feeling like if you're a Muslim mom, where are you going to raise your kids? Where they can be whole humans, where you don't have to worry about state violence or bigotry or Islamophobia. And I say that knowing there are many Muslim countries where you could really do that. But in given that so much of the world, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can correct me. Maybe it's not so much of the world, but I think I put my mama hat on, and I want to know our next generations coming up. It feels bleak.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Deepa. That's a really important question. And, I appreciate, the very human element of it because, my book is about state violence and as you know, right, the ways that Islamophobia is entrenched. But of course, it has very real consequences on the daily lives of Muslims. And I think that people don't often see that or feel it or think it's too abstract, but it really does have consequences in how we live our lives. And I often tell my friends, where am I going to go? And it's not even just, the countries like India and China that are overt and explicit, but also Muslim majority countries that use Islamophobic narratives as well to further their own national security agendas. And, what the US successfully did is not only to wage its own war on terror, but to create a blueprint for which other countries could use to wage their own war on terrors domestically in their countries against their communities and citizens. And in many cases, that happens to be Muslim. They happen to be Muslim. So, I mean, I think you know, this is a global phenomenon. Of course, there are particularities depending on where you live in the world. But it is, I mean, honestly, it is very depressing. It's extremely depressing. I mean, there were times, this is like slightly tangential, but, you know, there were times that I was just writing on autopilot because if I stopped, I would just have a breakdown because it was so painful. And it does leave you with the question of where do Muslims go? And, you know, of course, there are Muslims, there is a range, right, of the ways we experience Islamophobia. And, you know, we have to at the same time acknowledge that there are Muslims that are experiencing it much worse than others, depending on where they live and, you know, what particular identities they have. But nevertheless, just to have this basic feeling of safety, I am not entirely sure where that is at this point. And, you know, I don't think there's any part of the globe, even if it's not, you know, especially overt and explicit, but that hasn't been touched by Islamophobia in the context of national security and the ways that the US's blueprint and narrative framework has proliferated across the globe, especially post 9/11.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deepa, for I mean, your brilliant insight and comments and questions for Maha. That was a really wonderful conversation, and I love that engagement. I'm going to just maybe pose one question, and for the sake of time, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And my question to you, Maha, is in relation to democracy. And so I want to understand, how does the othering of Muslims by way of Islamophobia, the war on terror narrative, as well as post 9/11 policies, etc., all the things that go along with this, how does it undermine democracy, whether that's here in the United States or when we're thinking about democracy abroad?
Well, if we talk about this country itself, right? I mean, and we're talking about, I guess we could say American citizens, which, you know, all the people that I interviewed in the book were. You know, when you're othering communities, when you're oppressing communities, when you're treating them as, you know, less than or demonized, right? You're giving them the impression and suggesting to them that they should not be a part of this country, that they should not participate in the very systems, right, of democracy that, you know, theoretically allowed this country to maintain its moral superiority. And, you know, as you know, one of the frameworks I talked about in the book was this idea of how social constructions are embedded into the laws and policies of the country. And so when you have these social constructions that are embedded, and there are particular messages that are sent to communities, and if they are receiving these negative messages about they don't belong here, you're terrorists, you're evil, right? All of these messages are going to make them less likely to participate in democratic systems. And the whole idea of a democracy, right, is that all citizens feel that they can participate in the community, in the governance of the country. And it's very intentionally done that that's not the case, despite the consistent proclamations that this country is a democracy. And when it comes to other countries, right, especially when the United States claims it's going to other countries to build democracies, right, it's as if it's the relationship between, as I talked about, sort of the abuser and the abused, right? It's, we're going to build democracy, but we're going to harm you at the same time, right? We're going to make you in need of us. And that's not a democracy, right? And the United States is not even close to being a good example of a democracy. And we know that for many reasons, including the consistent marginalization of communities. And so how is it then going to take this failing model to other countries? And the reason it does, of course, is because we know it's just an excuse to implement colonial imperialistic, you know, tactics and interventions. But I think it is very problematic. And, you know, if the idea was to actually support and buttress whatever systems we have in this country that could theoretically yield a democracy, then we'd have to cede the otherization, demonization, and criminalization of so many communities, including Muslims, so that there is active participation and participation without fear, because that is a serious barrier in this country post 9/11, is how can we participate in these systems without experiencing, you know, pushback, without experiencing repercussions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maha. I want to turn now to questions from the audience. Mark, what do we got? Great, from Lukeya. To what extent do you think the war on terror has impacted anti-Muslim policies and narratives outside the US? Brilliant question.
I think to a large extent. I think any country that has wanted to implement restrictive and regressive national security policies has relied on the US's war on terror to do that, to do just that, whether it's the UK with the PREVENT program, right? Whether it's China with the crackdown on the Uyghurs, whether it's the Philippines with also the crackdown on Muslims. This again has proliferated, and the war on terror has provided endless amounts of rhetoric, policies, and laws from which other countries can draw and implement the same or very similar. And, again, it's not just about participating in the US's own war on terror, but also implementing their own war on terrors against their own communities. And we see this in countries across the globe, not just when you're talking about, countries where there's a relatively homogenous population, but in countries such as Israel that is using the same exact strategies and tactics to criminalize Palestinians.
Thank you, Maha. And great point. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Great. From Manny, we have, could one of the strategies be to show that Islam is a religion of love and unity that has been misunderstood, and to show that we Muslims are charitable, caring, and loving?
That is not a strategy that I personally think would be very successful, and the reason is because that would have to suppose that those who were trying to get to think otherwise about Islam and Muslims are open-minded, but in reality, usually those who have certain conceptions and perceptions of Islam and Muslims have enough evidence to the contrary and simply choose not to believe it, or simply choose to continue to be steeped in their biases. And this is not to say that, some people cannot change, some people can change, and some people can, encounter and engage with other perspectives and come out with ideas about Islam that are positive and really focus on how, the beauty of Islam. But at the same time, I think if we invest too much energy into convincing people about what kind of religion Islam is and what kind of people Muslims are, I think we're often at a loss, because that is not what people are open to. And I think ultimately that is just, honestly, in some cases, just wasting our time, because that's not what people want to hear. And we're just doing it based on our belief and our desire to want to believe that that is what's going to succeed, when in fact, I don't think, and again, this is not a blanket statement, but I think it succeeds far less than we might want to believe.
Mm-hmm. And I actually have a question that kind of piggybacks on that a little bit from Manny, which connects to narrative work and kind of undoing the narrative that we're faced with the war on terror. So as part of the important work to change the narrative that perpetuates and sanctions the war on terror, how can Muslims and non-Muslims effectively disconfirm, which is a term that you use in your book, disconfirm harmful stereotypes about Muslims without further perpetuating or upholding the dominant narratives that produce these stereotypes in the first place? So as an example, and I actually really don't want to use an example, but I feel like it could be helpful. The example of trying to disconfirm the Islamophobic and Orientalist stereotype that Muslim women are oppressed. How can we challenge that stereotype, or better yet, how can we flip the question around in a way so that our responses don't lend itself to the dominant narrative and perpetuating these harmful stereotypes? Because ultimately, I think we need to change the narrative so that these questions aren't even being asked of us.
Well, I think a lot of times when we're talking about communities that have been marginalized, the narrative tends to want to view us as very narrowly conceived. So yeah, are there Muslim women that are oppressed? Yes. Are there Muslim women who are not oppressed? Yes. And so the fact that we cannot see Muslim communities with any nuance whatsoever is one of the biggest problems. And so I think being able to push back and challenge these ideas and say that, the Muslim community is not monolithic. The Muslim community has problems just like any other community, right? There are, we talk about Muslims oftentimes as though they're uniquely patriarchal and misogynistic. And frankly, I don't have empirical evidence to know exactly, where Muslim communities fall compared to other communities. But the point is that we accept these ideas without critique, right? And so I think when we're making these assertions or accepting these assertions, right, what is the evidence to suggest that? And, it's not to say that communities can't have a problem with, say, it's patriarchy, right? Some communities are more patriarchal than other communities. That doesn't mean that they can't change, nor does it mean that they have to change at the pace in which other communities and societies are changing. So it really comes down to, right, just this idea that communities are nuanced, and there are so many layers of problematic narratives that have been stacked against Muslims that even trying to dispel one simple idea that is a problem means you have to take away and shed away and sort of like chip at all the other narratives that have collectively contributed to the ways in which that one is entrenched and so deeply entrenched. And so I think, when we're dealing with questions like Muslim women are oppressed, or dealing with we have to refute this assertion or assumption, when we're not doing that, chipping away at all the other layers, right? Thinking about, how do we engage in conversations around Muslims, right? How do we talk about Muslims? So it's not just about, this counter narrative that legitimizes by refutation the dominant status quo. And, I'm always happy to talk about narratives because of how important I think they are. But needless to say, I think unfortunately, a lot of Muslims' counter narrative work has involved simple refutations that take for granted and that accept the assumption that the dominant narrative should hold weight and the status quo is worth our countering.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Ruqayya. And what suggestions do you have, if any, for individuals to do on a practical level to challenge Islamophobia? And finally, I want to say thank you very much for this massively insightful event.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways. I think, one of the things that I often think about is, again, this distinction between the different forms of Islamophobia. So there's, interpersonal, there's internalized, there's institutionalized. And I think a lot of times people find it more comprehensible or perhaps, I don't want to necessarily say easier, but easier to, envision what interventions look like in an interpersonal context. But I think recognizing that a lot of what shapes the interpersonal Islamophobia is the institutionalized Islamophobia. So really thinking about how are these two things connected, and to what extent do we have to challenge and combat the source of the violence in order to target what we're trying to do with internal and interpersonal Islamophobia. So thinking again sort of about those different levels. Also just really paying attention to the narratives that are being espoused. I think the Russia's war against Ukraine has illuminated a lot of the discrepancies and ways in which, there is a differential treatment of people depending on what countries they're in and what the color of their skin is. So paying attention to these narratives and pushing back, and not in a way that, we don't want to get into hierarchies of oppression or, whatever, like things that are really speak to, minimizing human suffering. But we do need to think about, right, what communities are really being targeted on the basis of these narratives that continue to persist, and narratives that not only does the state reiterate, but that society and the media reiterate as well. So I think there's a lot of work to do on the narrative front, and just generally, I mean, there's a lot of policy work to do also as well. And a lot of that does happen at the local level. So I'd say also getting involved with local organizations and community groups that are doing the work to inform their communities about the harms of Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Maha. We are running up on time, and it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience, but I did wanted to just open it up to Deepa if you had any closing thoughts or parting words or questions for Maha.
This is the book. Maha won't do it, but you should all read it. Yep, there it is. And I I just thank you, because as someone who does follow a lot of these issues, we don't often take the time to stop and do the exhaustive collection and cataloging that you have done here of the blow by blow since 9/11. And I feel like it's for those of us who care, for those of us who report about these issues, it's a must read, and hopefully it will spread out there. So for all of you who are watching, pass it on, get a copy for somebody else to read. That many people are asking, what can we do? I think the first thing is to learn about it. So get a copy for somebody else as well, because it's really important to support the work when somebody takes all this effort to write such a thorough and comprehensive book. So, I feel very educated, and I am appreciative of being here. So thank you for having me. And Dr. Hilal, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Deepa, and really thank you for all your contributions. Thank you for being such a principled and credible journalist. That has gone a long way, so really thank you for that. And thank you, Basima, so much for putting together this event. I remember when it was just an idea a couple months ago, and here we are months later in Ramadan. So thank you for this, and and thank you to the Othering and Belonging Institute for hosting this event. It's really been an honor to be in conversation with you both.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilal and Deepa. It's been, an honor for us to host you and to have this conversation. So thank you both so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining this event and talk. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much, everyone.